All right, so this is a piece I've played a few times now, and I don't really ever get the chance to talk about it before playing because it's an intimidating piece to play. So I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about it now when I'm not going to have to concentrate for an hour and a half. The Goldberg Variations was written in 1741. Um, it was BWV 988 and part of a collection called the Klavierübung, which is basically a didactic collection of pieces intended to teach people how to play the piano. This is, I believe, the third part of that set. And the sort of supposed backstory for it was written for a count, for his harpsichordist Goldberg, to play while he was trying to sleep. So he supposedly suffered from insomnia. So this was written for him to like pass away the time while he was trying to fall asleep. So basically, I want to go over the overall structure of it, and then I'll play a couple of examples because I'm at the piano now. That's where I got the idea. Piano side chats from FDR instead of fireside piano side. So the overall structure, it's built over an ostinato or a ground bass, which is essentially a pattern of notes in the left hand that goes over and over again throughout the entire piece. And I'll just play that. That's the whole first half of each variation. The whole second half. So basically, everything, the entire piece is built on top of that. And all of the, like, normally when you have a theme and variations, the theme is like a melody, like, I played these at the other concert that we did recently, and then the variations are. So it just kind of plays around with the theme, but this, instead, the variations are over top, and they are over that bass line that I just played. So then you get the aria, which is just the introduction, essentially, to the variations, but it still has the same bass line, and it's called an aria because it has a very vocal style. Let me just play a little bit of it. And if you pay attention here with the aria, you can hear I'm just going to play it not in a way that you'd want to hear it, but showing the left hand. So you can kind of hear that left hand, that melody there that repeats over and again. And so then going to the first variation, let me just play you a little bit of that so you can see that same thing. I'll play it normally first, and then I'll exaggerate the bass line, the ostinato. on surface level, doesn't really sound related at all to the first thing, but then if you're playing exaggerated, sorry. So you can hear that. It's all sort of hidden down there in the left hand. Also, the overall structure of the piece. Now that we could go beyond variation 1, variation 2 is kind of a canon of sorts. Every third variation in the piece is a canon, which is basically where you have a melody that repeats after a certain amount of time. So like, row, row, row your boat, row, row, row your boat, then row, row, row your boat. But also over that bass lines that I played before. These canons, each one is a canon at a different interval. So on the piano, there's intervals. Like, I was trying to get it so my hands could be seen easier before, but I couldn't get a cable long enough to connect the internet. Okay, so like the space between notes is an interval. So each canon starts at a different interval. The first canon is a canon at the unison, meaning that it starts on the same note. Like when you sing row, 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 row your boat, it starts on the same note. So that's what this one looks like this. The melody of the canon starts, and then it happens again. So let me play some of it. So you get the idea that there's so my right hand is playing the same thing, just offset by a bar, so offset by time. And that the interval that this happens by, so either the first one's at a unison, meaning they start on the same note, then there's one at the second, third, fourth. It keeps getting to be a larger interval throughout the piece. I also, when I play this, I like to talk a little bit about how it was written for what's called a double manual harpsichord. So with the piano, you have the one keyboard. With the harpsichord, you had harpsichords that had one keyboard, but you also had harpsichords that had two keyboards. So the harpsichord was not able to change dynamics because instead of, as with the piano has a hammer that strikes the string, the harpsichord plucked the string. So there was, when you press the key down, there was this thing that kind of looked like a hook that plucks the string up. But so playing harder on that instrument won't make it do anything to pluck the string harder because it just is not capable of doing that. So what they did is they would have separate keyboards with like different quality of sound for those strings on the other keyboard. So this piece was actually written for a double manual harpsichord, meaning, and know what that means when you try to play it on the piano is there's oftentimes the same notes that you have to play. So you have to play notes that should be played on two separate keyboards, one hand over the top, but instead with the modern piano, you have to play essentially both hands on top of each other. So I'm going to play a little bit of an example of that. So basically what happens there is some of the notes that I'm playing, I have to choose which hand plays what note because I should be playing two of the same notes, but it's not possible to physically do that on the piano. Then after that was variation 5. Variation 6, you get another canon, which is like what I was saying with Row, Row, Row Your Boat, but this one is at the interval of a second. So basically, it's the same melody, but instead of starting on the same note, it starts one note higher. And that's... and you still have that same bass line in the left hand. It's kind of difficult to hear, but I'll try to exaggerate. it's just basically the first note of every bar is that bass line. Now the seventh variation is a jig, which is a dance. It's sort of a lively, spirited dance. It wasn't intended to be dance to, but it kind of derives from that style. So I don't want to play it all right now. Variation 8, you can still hear that bass line. So you can still hear that same bass line there. Variation 9 is another canon, except this time at the third. So you can see that every 3 variations there's another canon. Variation 10 is a fuguetta, which means a smaller fugue. Now, fugue is where you have a melodic idea, or what's called a subject in the context of a fugue, and it is played by different voices, and it sort of weaves its way throughout the piece. So you have, there's what's called the exposition of a fugue, which is where you have each of the voices that are going to have that melody throughout, they kind of declare it. So here you have that with the lower voice says it, or does that melody, then the middle voice, and then there's the highest voice does it, and then there is like the voice in between. So let's just get the example of that. But you can hear how that subject is happening all the time. It happens in different parts of the instrument, and that's the whole first half right there. And that is still just essentially what would be called the exposition of the fugue. But you still have that. You still have that underneath. So if you kind of keep that in your ear. It's still that same pattern. Variation 11 also presents a lot of hand crossing issues. So you can see, hopefully you can see a little bit that there's a lot of notes that are just like this, or even just the same note. Like when composers write hand crossings like that, it's kind of a thing to show off, but they usually don't write the same note, so you don't actually have to play 2 of the same notes, because that's not possible to do on the piano. But on the double manual harpsichord, it would have been possible. Variation 12 is another canon. Every 3 there's another canon. And you can hear pretty obviously, you can hear that bass line. Yeah. So you can hear that pretty obviously. Variation 13 is an aria. So basically, I've talked a lot about opera in these things, but opera is not just something that happens on a stage or in a theater. Opera is also something that's imitated a lot in other styles of music, especially in keyboard music, because keyboard instruments for a long time didn't really know where they were going in terms of their own unique style. You didn't really get music that was keyboard oriented until the late classical period. They always tended to imitate other styles. Like, yes. So, for example, this one imitates an opera aria. And so on and so forth. But basically, that thinking about it like that kind of influences how you play it, because if you're going to sing something, you're going to need to breathe. So you need to kind of give time in order to show that breathing. 14, a lot of hand crossings, variation 14. A lot of hand crossings. 15 is another canon, but this time we get a canon in the minor key. So this is not in the relative minor, but this is actually in the parallel minor, because in order to maintain that pattern, instead of going to the minor which shares the same sharps and flats, he goes to the minor that shares the same home key or tonic key, which is G minor. So. And so on. Variation 16, we have a French overture, which is, it just says overture in the style, but it is specifically a French overture because in early 18th century opera, there was sort of a trope that the overture, which is the thing that comes before the action, always had a specific format in French opera during that time. And this would be kind of a grandiose, slower tempo opening, which would then, after the slower tempo, then you'd get a fugue section. I think we may have lost one of our people. Did we? Yeah, we did. I'm going to just pause for a second. Okay, so the French overture style was basically the trope of a quicker openings section with a lot of flourishes in the strings, like that's imitated in here. So like a scale pattern. And what's called overdotting, where you have a dotted rhythm like yum, ba-bum, ba-bum, but you make it really extra short. So yum, ba-bum, ba-bum. So here's the first section. So basically you have those scale patterns and you have that dotting. Now the second half of the French overture style is a contrapuntal section, kind of like a fugue like we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's all often at a quicker tempo, usually twice the speed of the beginning tempo. So let's just go to the transition between those two. So you have that change in speed, and you have the contrapuntal change in musical texture there. So that gives it that French overture style. 17 is another difficult hand crossing thing. Actually, the variation itself is not that difficult, but you can see with the hand crossing. Let me angle this. So basically you have to do. So my hands are, my individual fingers are having to cross as I'm doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it was a separate keyboard, it would make it a lot easier. But
That's right.
the fact that it's just all in the same doesn't really work. But you try your best. Variation 18 is another canon, which is like but this time at the interval of a 6, because remember the canons are always increasing. So you hear the. So that's the same melody, just at a different interval. And then the left hand is playing a third voice, which is sort of an elaboration of that bass line. So on and so forth. Variation 19, actually a lot of these, especially 18 and 19, are kind of what would be considered like a trio sonata. So in the Baroque period, one of the most popular forms of chamber music was three people playing, usually like two wind instruments and a keyboard, but three separate voice parts. So you have the top voice, and then you have a middle voice, and then you have the lower voice. Then you put them all together. And then Bach switches them. So you see there's the middle voice is now playing what the top voice played. So it's just a lot of interesting working there. 20 presents a lot of hand crossing things. But you actually can hear that some of the notes are being played twice, and really depending on the piano. So just slower. I missed it. Depending on the specific instrument, that can be really difficult to actually keep together. We get another minor variation for 21, and it is at the interval of a seventh. Now the seventh is an interval that is kind of difficult to write a canon at, because it's not a particularly pleasing interval to the ear. So, but I think Bach kind of creates a very chromatic, chromatic being all the half steps on the keyboard, and quite cool harmonically. And you can see the left hand, the bass line is that same thing, but he fills it in chromatically. So instead of being just that descending notes, so he fills in sort of a whole chromatic scale there. Then we have 22 is an à la brève, which is sort of a reference to Renaissance counterpoint, which is à la brève was a specific style for motets. It referred to the tempo and also just the overall character of it. So this is basically kind of a reference to Renaissance polyphony, this one. But you can hear in the left hand, the same thing that we had in the opening. Etc. 23 has more hand crossing. But, you know, who knows, maybe the count had fallen asleep by that point. You never know. 24 is a canon at the octave, so another canon like every three variations. You can hear it enters in the left hand. So it's basically you have to kind of do the job of an entire choir and hear all of those things as they enter, because if you don't, then no one else hears them. Variation 25 is one of the coolest because it's in the minor key again, so G minor. It's also incredibly chromatic. It doesn't sound like Bach at all. It sounds like something that was, you know, written in the early 20th century. Let me play a little bit of it. It also kind of imitates that opera style. So it's very much like the right hand is an opera singer. singing their aria, and the left hand is just the orchestral accompaniment. And so on. 26 is cool because this whole piece has been kind of a collection of different styles of music at that time. So like we had the reference to Renaissance, trio sonatas, dances. This is actually a reference to two separate things. So this is a tarantella, which is a quick dance that was the sort of the backstory is like that if you were bitten by a tarantula, you had to dance and twirl very quickly in order to get the venom out. Probably doesn't work, but I hope to never try it. Then the left hand is playing a saraband, which is a different style of slow dance that I believe originated in Spain. And that you can tell these apart because the tarantella is very quick and just kind of keeps moving like that swirling and spinning I was saying, and the saraband is kind of a slow and stately type of feeling, and it's characterized by the rhythm bum bum bum. So it always has that dun 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 bum bum. So you can hear them at the same time. Plus, there's all sorts of crazy hand crossings, just because, you know, as if that wasn't complicated enough. Then actually right here, it changes. So in the beginning you can tell that my left hand, even though it's in the place where my right hand should be, is playing the saraband. So I'll play it. And then the other hand, my right hand, is playing that tarantella, but then it switches. So you have the left hand playing that tarantella dance and the right hand playing the saraband. So 27 is also another canon, and it heavily references the style of the time, which was called an invention, a two-part invention, which was basically kind of a student counterpoint piece. So it would only have two voices, whereas a lot of these pieces have three separate parts that are going at the same time. This one would only have two. An invention would either have two or three, and it was kind of a piece to help you prepare for more complicated pieces. So you can hear there's only two. So my right hand plays one part, my left hand plays the other part. Variation 28 is kind of interesting because of you have this texture that's created with a perpetual trill, and at the same time as the other parts are. It creates a very cool atmosphere and texture. 29 is what is essentially a prelude. So now a prelude, it just basically means something that comes before something, kind of like an overture, but it was a very specific thing in this time period. It was usually like the first movement of a suite or a collection of pieces was a prelude, and what it originated from, like 100 years or so before Bach, it was just basically something that someone would improvise to let people know that the piece was about to start. So like, if I was going to start something in G major, I would do like, and then I would start my piece. But that was just like, okay, everyone, we're ready. It's like if you're at an opera house, they have those chimes. So essentially, the prelude was kind of a fancy way of doing the everyone take your seats. But you have that here, and it has that improvised character and that sort of flourished character, which I showed. So you can see that type of a flourish character to show people that stuff starting, which is kind of also kind of entertaining because it's a prelude, which is something at the beginning, and it's right before the end. So we kind of get the whole feeling of completing a cycle with this piece, that when we get to the end is actually the beginning of something else. And that'll come back in a second too. And then the final one is quadlibet, which is basically when you have two melodies at the same time. So you have this, which is your bass line, and you have now that these melodies, it's kind of like if you play, it's kind of like playing two different pop songs at the same time or something like that. So it sounds kind of a little bit chaotic, but it all fits together. So you can kind of hear that those melodies at the same time, and it's kind of essentially they were kind of not very appropriate drinking songs of the day that he chose to put in, which is kind of entertaining because this is kind of the apotheosis moment of the whole piece, and one of the songs is like cabbages and potatoes, and the other one is, I think the title is like, oh, I have been away from you for so long. And it's a very, very cool moment. And then at the end of this, we come back to the aria, which is what we started with. So it's essentially the completing of that cycle. And it comes back, so we have this sort of, in a way, I feel like these last three variation, 29, 30, and the aria kind of complete their own set. They kind of all tie back and complete this whole cycle. So I hope you enjoyed the talk.